very anarchistic, to the people, right? Power to the people. All power to the people. Right on.
We are the only ones that are going to save us. On Anti-Black Solidarity and the Collective Unconscious by Charlie Benga and Samaya. Author's note. As we stated elsewhere, we're not academics or professors, nor are we post-grad students working to defend a dissertation. We are simply Black anarchists that have an interest in Black studies, but from outside of academic institutions. We use these pertinent critical theories within our literary and activist works to provide radical education for inquiring minds and to enhance our understanding on the things that are happening on the ground within our communities and left-wing political spaces. However, if you're interested in pieces written by scholars, here's some great reading recommendations. Frank B. Wilderson III's essay, Gramsci's Black Marks, Whither the Slave in Civil Society, Jared Sexton's essay, The Veil of Slavery, Tracking the Figure of the Unsovereign, and Patrice D. Douglas's essay, Black Feminist Theory for the Dead and Dying. Initially, we arrived at the concept of the collective unconscious through Professor Wilderson's work and realized that further study was needed on what it is exactly and how it could be a contributing factor to the anti-Blackness civil society displays on the daily. This is what led us to crafting the following essay. Quote, to fathom the mechanism and structures of racially violent fixations and obsessional neuroses, it is not enough to point out the oppressive experience of the social and its myriad forms of institutional violence against Black people. One must also explain the effects of unconscious and identification on racial identity. End quote. David Marriott, Haunted Life, Visual Culture, and Black Modernity. The Motif of Darkness and the Objective Psyche. What if we told you that there is a sector of everyone's mind that has a considerable impact on the way we all act towards others, and we are never truly in control of what has been deposited in that portion of our psyche? What if the basement of our brain, if you will, stores certain info based on learned and observed behavior from our ancestors? That is to say, things are passed down to us throughout history that are stored in our mental unconsciously, even if it's not rooted in a personal experience. Theorizing from an Afro-pessimist perspective, we utilize the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, the objective psyche, to get at the heart of why other races are in agreement with people of African descent being the most marginalized group within the racial hierarchy. Unlike the conscious mind, which is comprised of all the things we have active knowledge of, such as our thoughts, feelings, actions, and emotions, etc., the collective unconscious, in particular, is often defined in contradistinction to that of the personal unconscious. As stated in the collected works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 1, he describes it as a, quote, part of the psyche which can be negatively distinguished from the personal unconscious by the fact that it does not, like the latter, owe its existence to personal experience and consequently is not a personal acquisition. While the personal unconscious is made up essentially of contents which have at one time been conscious, but which have disappeared from consciousness through having been forgotten or repressed, the contents of the collective unconscious have never been in consciousness and therefore have never been individually acquired, but owe their existence exclusively to heredity. Whereas the personal unconscious consists for the most part of complexes, the content of the collective unconscious is made up essentially of archetypes. End quote. This delineation between the two is crucial for understanding the difference in how they both function in the mind. The collective unconscious does not emerge or evolve from personal and individual experiences, but rather from universal and inherited experiences. Think of it like an internal shared archive that contains motifs, themes, symbols, and archetypes that spans across every culture and is common to all of humanity. Archetypes are structural mechanisms that constitutes the collective unconscious, a mutual psychic functioning that resonates with us all. It embodies certain instincts, traits, perceptions, desires, and characteristics. Most of us are familiar with stereotypes, but it's important to not get the two confused. Stereotypes are often flat and precise, one-dimensional concepts rooted in a generalization of people, places, or things. Stereotypes provide no room for deeper understanding, since at their core, they are crafted out of narrow perspectives. Whereas for Jung, an archetype is an innate commonality that allows us to latch onto the link that already exists due to several of them already being harvested in the collective unconscious. Although it's rarely discussed, an archetype can also sustain, perpetrate, and/or be complicit in anti-Black behaviors, attitudes, and activity. Many, if not all, archetypes blossom out of rudimentary symbolic themes, such as good versus evil, right versus wrong, and most importantly, in regard to Blackness, light versus darkness. These common themes are foundational in structuring the human psyche. But how does anti-Blackness enter into the collective unconscious, and how can one even begin to illustrate this phenomenon? Perhaps it can be done on a metaphysical level by analyzing the amalgamation of recurring paradigms, assemblages, and dualisms that consistently puts darkness, Blackness, in an antithetical or abject position. For example, across the ages, we can see this appearing in Chinese mythology with the concept of yin and yang. Yin, the white side of the symbol, represents things in nature that are receptive. It attracts and possesses the ability to draw inward or pull something back. In contrast, yang, the dark side of the symbol, embodies things in nature that are repelling or repulsive. It's meant to deter, not to stimulate. It is also present in spiritual/religious practices such as Manichaeism. The goal for the Manichaean is to strive towards goodness, godliness, or purity because it puts them closer to the light. The light illuminates, brings forth understanding, soothes the soul in its uncertainties about life. Therefore, it is necessary to constantly distance oneself from evil, darkness, as to ensure one is not tainted by what may lurk or live in this unknown place where no light comes through. In the darkness, the pathway is obscured by unending shadows that would cause one to stumble if they dare to venture through it. The type of dualism present in yin and yang and in Manichaeism exposes a conundrum as old as time, choosing between either the light side or dark side, or striving to remain good when the boogeyman of darkness seeks to claim you. Non-Black colorisms and the disdain for darker pigmentation existing for centuries within so many cultures worldwide is also indicative of this notion that darkness is seen as something inherently wicked and reprehensible. The historic mistreatment and persecution of the Roma people all across Europe is a great example of that. Which is to say, many factors played a major role in anti-Gypsyism, but one could argue that them being depicted as sorcerers, mystics, and witches of the dark magical arts, demonic travelers adorned with darker skin, hair, eyes, and other non-Aryan features, was ultimately the most significant reason for their discrimination. Some other examples will be the dichotomy between people who may share the same race but are extremely prejudiced on the basis of class or caste divisions and complexion differences. Take the numerous Asian ethnicities, for instance. The pale-skinned East Asians are often biased towards the more tan-skinned Southeast Asians, and the fair-skinned North Indians often discriminate against the more brown-skinned South Indians. Even in a lot of Arab, Southwest Asian communities, you'll find that it's distasteful to marry someone with a dark skin tone because of the irrational fear that it can somehow sully and contaminate the family's beautiful bloodline. And if that is the standard within their own households and community circles, imagine how they feel about the ones they call Abid, derogatory Arabic slur for Black slaves/servants. Nonetheless, if we know that intercultural discrepancies around darkness existed long ago and is still prevalent in today's society, it shouldn't be surprising that this aversion of the dark, the Black, can also be molded into a weapon of sorts, extended outside of the bounds of one's own ethnic origins, and projected onto the other not-so-light or white communities in an impressive manner. The few examples above contextualize how the term darkness, embodying the existential thematics of death, dread, and defectiveness, has undergone many transitions throughout time. It is manifested as both an oppositional force and a negative connotation in relation to motifs. It has been used as a placeholder to describe nothingness, a void-like entity designated for the undesirables and the unknown. But what happens when darkness goes beyond grammar and metaphysical mysticism to then being seen as a corporeal materialism when imposed on Africans through racial slavery? What does it mean when darkness is enforced upon a people whose skin color seemingly matches this descriptor? History implicates darkness becomes synonymous with Blackness and Blackness coterminous with slaveness, social death. An ontological rupture occurs. A cataclysmic chain of events eviscerates our very understanding of reality and relations. Put differently, the Mafa, the 1400-year African Holocaust, transpires as a result. This is evident by the atrocities of the 7th century Arab slave trade and the 15th century European transatlantic slave trade. Colonial acts of terror, capture, and commodification, which inevitably led to Africans being stripped of their lineage, land, language, and lifeways below ship decks during the Middle Passage. The process of what Hortense Spillers calls ungendering, all of which culminates into this violent structural antagonism, the anti-blackness we're currently seeing and experiencing in the contemporary. The non-blacks' Negrophobia. Amidst the Israeli government's genocidal and relentless rampage throughout the Arab world, and more poignantly, the recent attacks on Lebanon in the beginning of March, another story emerges from the shadows of the region. In a recent interview conducted by Al Jazeera English media, Banchi Imer, an Ethiopian feminist, activist, domestic worker, and founder of Egna Legna Besadet, a nonprofit, migrants-led organization that focuses on women's issues, reveals an unsettling truth about conditions on the ground. In so many ways, she explains how there's a prioritization of resources and emergency services being distributed to only Lebanese nationals, while there's a noticeable absence and denial of support, aid, and assistance when it comes to the African migrant workers. Imer's report makes it clear that the workers' well-being is less than an afterthought and perhaps not even a thought at all. Far removed from their homes, black migrants are seemingly left to fend for themselves, since those in control of the means have decided that African lives do not hold the same weight as Lebanese ones. Despite everyone living under the relentless bombardment facilitated by the Israeli occupation, they've essentially been abandoned and barred from shelters where their former employers have sought refuge and received help. To combat this, Banchi's community-based collective, which fights against racial/gender discrimination and the legalized labor exploitation that is made possible by the unfair kafala system, is currently doing their best to provide relief efforts for the marginalized migrants within the area. It's unfortunate that black life is being shoved to the wayside. However, this is not a new phenomenon. On the contrary, it is a regular occurrence, a cruel but common scene that is often replicated ubiquitously worldwide. If we look back to February 2022, when Russia waged war on Ukraine and invaded the region with intentions of gaining control and seizing territory, a European conflict that is still ongoing, we can see another similar situation to the one mentioned and laid out above. Testimonies from African students trying to flee to safety and elude the stark death that military warfare brings erupted all across social media. Black undergraduates and scholars that were studying in Ukraine's educational institutions relayed stories of mistreatment, negligence, abuse, and racial profiling when attempting to cross the border, just like the other Ukrainian citizens trying to escape into other neighboring countries. They spoke about how the authorities prioritized whites and permitted them to travel before the dark-skinned foreigners, leaving many to wait in severe weather conditions. Videos even surfaced online of violent uniformed men acting aggressively towards students who were just sitting in the cold. The countries of Lebanon and Ukraine are obviously two different places, and the reasons as to why the African students and African migrants were even in those countries to begin with differs also. Yet somehow they all had or are having the same kind of abject experience, being neglected, discarded, and overlooked because of their blackness. The biased and bigoted behavior exhibited by both Lebanese and Ukrainian officials reveals a pattern of conduct that seems to always make its way to the fore whenever black people are present in any space. No matter where we go or what we're doing, it's as if everyone globally is following a scripted screenplay that gives the whites and non-black actors one main directive. Make sure they, the Negro cast, stay in their rightful place on and off set. It's like a mass text is being sent out around the world saying, make sure those inferior colored people go last. Treat them like the lesser beings they are. Of course, what's happening is much more complex than that, since the behavior exhibited towards black folks by others suggests that there is something else making, or rather compelling people to act the way they do. Let's be clear, some people are in fact very much aware that they are behaving in a problematic manner. But are they even privy to the historic psychological factors involved in making them believe, say, and act the way they do against us? Furthermore, what about those complicit in such demeaning interactions that genuinely cannot see where they are going wrong or how they are contributing to a problem that has gone on long before we had the language to even call it for what it is? Another emblematic example arises in Chapter 1 of Afro-Pessimism by Frank B. Wilderson III. The author recounts a past conversation with his friend, comrade, and co-worker, Samir Bashira. Samir and Frank both worked as security guards at the Walker Art Center in downtown Minneapolis. Not only were the two both Aries, but they both shared the same revolutionary insurrectionist politics. On their lunch breaks, Frank recalls how the two would sit on this hill that overlooked the city and swap stories about what they each wanted to achieve in the struggle towards liberation and self-determination. Samir spoke of how he yearned to return to Ramallah to be a part of the Intifada taking place in Palestine to aid in his people's longtime struggle to be free from the Israeli occupation. Frank divulged how he one day hoped to go to Zimbabwe and fight for ZANU/ZAPU or join the Black Liberation Army with Assata Shakur. Frank empathized with Samir in his aspiration to help his people and fully supported the total abolition of the occupation in Palestine. Wilderson appreciated the camaraderie he shared with Samir, and this friendship at the time was seemingly proof of how, despite whatever differences that the two may have, the shared longing to be free from the forces that oppressed them both was what ultimately bound them together. There was no doubt in Frank's mind that him and his friend were on the same page and shared the same common enemy, the fascist Israeli and American empires. That is, until one routine lunch chat took a turn that shifted Wilderson's perspective. On this day in particular, Samir was speaking to Frank about a bombing that took place in Ramallah that resulted in his cousin's untimely death. Frank took notice of the fact that while his friend worked through his grief aloud, a wall seemed to resurrect itself around Samir as he appeared to no longer be fully present. It's as if his friend was on autopilot, and what was being said in this state of mind was clearly happening unconsciously. Frank was not put off by this. Instead, he listened, let him vent, and allowed Samir to air out any and all frustration he was feeling due to survivor's guilt. Samir, apparently forgetting that Frank was there, began speaking of a time when he was stopped and searched at an Israeli checkpoint. Haunted by the memory, Sam rants about, quote, the shameful and humiliated way the soldiers run their hands up and down your body, end quote. Frank is taken aback when his friend continues on, stating, quote, but the shame and humiliation runs even deeper if the Israeli soldier is an Ethiopian Jew, end quote. The main reason for highlighting this rather intriguing story is to focus on that last specific statement. What Samir's unconscious thought did was illuminate and uncloak the fact that he basically implied, unbeknownst to even himself, that he preferred a European Ashkenazi Jew to stop and frisk him rather than an East African Jew. What that Freudian slip of the tongue revealed to Frank in that moment was that the shame and humiliation of his friend being fondled non-consensually at checkpoints stemmed not only from the terror of living under the horrific conditions of an apartheid regime, but technically from being touched with hands that were attached to a black person. Indeed, he wasn't only disgusted simply because of their Zionist ideology and active participation in the authoritarian Jewish ethno-state. That is to say, the hatred and revulsions he felt towards them wasn't born solely out of the restrictive and consistent routine searches that polices and controls Palestinian movement. No, he was essentially bothered and grossed out by the racial schema of the Ethiopian Jew. The plight of his people enduring the brutal effects of the settler colonial Zionist regime is eclipsed by his unconscious anti-blackness, leaving behind the fact that if he needed a reason to despise this guard, it should specifically be because of their participation in the displacement and destruction of his people, not because of their black skin. This is why eventually Frank comes to the conclusion, quote, that in the collective unconscious, Palestinian insurgents have more in common with the Israeli state and civil society than they do with black people. What they share is a largely unconscious consensus that blackness is a locus of abjection to be instrumentalized on a whim, end quote. In other words, the allegiance Frank thought he had formed with Samir was not enough to overcome the implicit negrophobic kinship his friend and others hold within the collective unconscious. That silent alliance, that unthought pact and pledge, is none other than anti-black solidarity. The moment a black radical enters into a self-proclaimed emancipatory space, they will oftentimes be inundated with the mantra that our struggles as marginalized, oppressed, working-class poor people is what unites us all. Sure, but what is rarely, if ever spoken of, is the regular, unintentional union formed between non-blacks and whites. If they can acknowledge the ways in which some of our oppression intersects, but is not exactly the same, they should also be able to confess to the anti-black solidarity that binds them together also. Furthermore, it's obvious that many embrace collective liberation or join in solidarity with Black folks predicated on the ways Blackness is or has been beneficial to them. In essence, if they cannot find a way to make the oppression of Black people analogous with their own, they don't want to get involved. Black pain and suffering is never enough on its own merit for people to struggle alongside Black people, which is evident in the way they have no analysis of anti-Blackness but claim to be anti-racist. In order to prove that they are actually down, they give into the compulsion to name the relationship or attachment they have to our Blackness as their reason why. Case in point, a lot of white women were showing up to protest in 2020 with Black dildos and posters that essentially expressed the objectifying sentiment that because they are sexually involved with or attracted to Black men, that is why they should also give a fuck when they are brutalized or killed. This is a maneuver that reduces their bodies to a set of genitals, a prop for pleasure. It is through desire, fixation and fantasy, through transaction and extraction, through the workings and machinations of the libidinal economy that Black issues, and by proxy Black people, are then seen as viable. But the viability is contingent on fabrications that purport themselves to be rooted in genuine care and consideration. The uncomfortable truth is that some agents of anti-Blackness are cosplaying as comrades in arms who are committed to maintaining the racial hierarchy that keeps them above Black people. I hope you guys enjoyed that reading of On Anti-Black Solidarity and the Collective Unconscious by Charlie and I. That piece is available to read on Substack, of course. I didn't want to yap too much to you guys in the beginning because I know it's been a while, okay? So I just wanted to jump right in and then kind of catch up with you guys at the end. I did move recently, so that's been a pretty big change. I actually don't even have a chair to film in. Now, is that an excuse? No, because I'll be honest, I can make something shake, but I just really want to be intentional with the content that I put out, so it just takes some time to think, and I've been getting settled into the new place as well, and I do hope to have something new for you soon, but the move is pretty much the reason why you guys haven't even got a reading, because I feel like those are pretty much the most consistent thing on the channel for sure. The video essays take longer, but reading this piece was perfectly aligned considering how the last piece I read was also about anti-Blackness and was a great introduction to Afro-pessimist theory. So yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I appreciate you guys as always being just so patient and as always, telling me how much you guys love these types of videos as well. So I am going to try to really, while I get other content ready, just to find some really good pieces to read to you guys. But that is it for now. I am done yapping, but I did want to just kind of touch base with y'all real quick. You know what I'm saying? I left y'all like that, just wondering what's going on. But I appreciate y'all, and I will see you next time with another video.
It's not the destination.